My name's Erik Jensen. I'm the editor-in-chief of Schwartz Media and founding editor of the Saturday paper. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past and present and any First Nations people who might be in the room. I also need to thank the sponsor for this session, UNSW Sydney. And then to get into it properly, I wanted to start just with a note of reassurance for anyone who is afraid of artificial intelligence. And the reassurance is that I asked ChatGPT to plan this session for me. This is true, and it just wasn't very good. It was like a school essay where someone had skimmed the chapter titles, and I'd be embarrassed to ask the questions that it offered me. But it did write an introduction for the session, which was quite good, and I will read it now, partly because I also wanted, for the sake of representation, a machine involved in the panel. So this is ChatGPT's introduction to the session, Who's Afraid of AI? Welcome everyone to this Writers' Festival panel on the topic of AI. Our panelists today are Toby Walsh, author of Machines Behaving Badly, A Threat to the Future of Humanity, which is not the title of his book, and Tracey Spicer, author of Man-Made, The Essential Skewed Guide to Gender in the Workplace, which is also not the title of your book. I'm your moderator, Erik Jensen, a journalist and author based in Australia, which is true but not something I would say. Toby Walsh, this is still ChatGPT, is a renowned AI researcher, scientist and author who spent his career working to ensure that AI is used for the benefit of humanity. He is currently a professor of artificial intelligence at the University of New South Wales and has published over 400 papers on AI and robotics. In his book, Machine Behaving Badly, Toby explores the potential dangers of AI and offers insights into how we can manage this risk to create a better future. Okay. Tracey Spicer is a well-known Australian journalist, author and feminist who's been a leading voice in the fight for gender equality in the workplace. She's the founder of Outspoken Women, a speakers agency that represents women and non-binary people, and is a regular commentator on issues of gender and diversity. In her book, Man-Made, Tracey sheds light on the pervasive gender biases that exist in the workplace and offers practical solutions for creating a more equal and inclusive work environment. As for myself, I'm a journalist and author who's written extensively about politics, society and culture. I'm the author of Acute Misfortune, The Life and Death of Adam Cullen, got that title right, a biography of the controversial Australian artist which was later adapted into a critically acclaimed film. Their words, not mine. I'm honoured to be moderating this panel and look forward to a stimulating discussion on the intersections of AI and gender in the workplace. With such esteemed panellists, we're sure to have a thought-provoking and insightful conversation. AI can be good for the future and for society. Thank you, ChatGPT.
It says different things every time you ask it a question.
Yes.
I once asked it for a biography myself, and it said I had actually given up AI and started professional poker and won $7 million at the World Poker Championship, something I think I would have remembered.
Well, I should be clear, that is its second attempt. It did it the first time, and I said, could you make that better? and it did. Toby, I want to start with a question for you about why you became an AI researcher.
Well, it's nice that you asked me that at a book festival, because it's books.
Right.
It was because I read books. I was a young boy, I was reading Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov, and reading about a more optimistic future. I think it is hard not to be nostalgic when you look back at the past, but I think back then in the 70s and 80s, we were more optimistic about the future. I remember watching the Apollo moon missions, and people did think that science and technology were going to build us a better future. And I remember reading those books, and I was very lucky as a very young boy. I got my hands on a computer when I was 13 and started selling computer programs actually when I was 14, and realizing I could build that future. I could be someone who could help build the future. The sorts of intelligent robots and smart computers that I was reading about in Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke was something that I could help bring into existence, and that I thought at the time, naively maybe, was going to be a good thing.
I was going to ask if you maintained that optimism, but that would overshadow the rest of the panel, so I'm not going to. That's the kind of surprise we're going to hold for later. Tracey, you write about this in your book, but what made you start this kind of 7-year journey of wanting to understand AI?
A couple of different things that happened in the household. One morning while I was making breakfast, my then 11-year-old son turned around and said, "Mum, I want a robot slave." And I said, "Darling, what are you talking about?" He said, "Oh, well, I've been watching Cartman on South Park." We are obviously terrible, appalling parents. And Cartman was ordering around his Amazon Alexa like some kind of colonial overlord in this most shocking language. And as a lifelong feminist, I had an epiphany that the bias of the past, this idea about women and girls being servile, was being built into the machines that would run our futures. And over the next couple of years, I saw something very interesting happen to our son and our daughter. Our daughter, who was always stronger in maths and science, started to become more interested in the humanities, and our son, who was always very big on English and reading books, started to get into building computers with his friends in the class. And all of a sudden, I just saw what the future was going to be like. And the future was looking very, very male. And the more I looked into this subject, the future was also looking very, very white. So I went right down the rabbit hole of algorithms being used if you're applying for a job, if you're going to get a ventilator in hospital, if you want to emigrate to another country. Basically, these machines are deciding our futures, and it's not a future that's fair or equal.
Both of you begin your books by looking into the people who were there at the very start, the kind of godfathers or founding fathers of AI. And I think for the arguments made in your books, it's important to understand what they were thinking, the sort of ideological strains that were underpinning this group of people, and who they actually were. Toby, I'm wondering if you could start by telling us where AI came from.
Well, yeah, I mean,
it came out of.
You might think it arrived in the last few months, because it's only the last few months. It certainly got people's attention, but it goes back at least 70 years. I mean, you can trace back the intellectual origins, at least to if you want, all the way back to the ancient Greeks and the invention of logic and so on. But the field as a start, artificial intelligence has actually a start date. It's very unusual to have a scientific subject, a discipline where you can say it started in this particular year, and it started in 1956. The very first conference was held, and John McCarthy, who was a eminent computer scientist at Stanford, came up with the name artificial intelligence to describe the conference. Artificial intelligence didn't exist before that because he came up with the name then. And he collected together quite an interesting collection of people to you've got to realize the intellectual moment there was that computers were just becoming available, and people were saying, what could we do with them? And he and a group of other people, mostly white male people, came together and said, well, maybe we could get them to do the sorts of things that humans do, about seeing the world, reasoning about the world, and with robots acting in the world. And so they had the very first conference. And they said at the time, when they applied for funding, we will make a significant progress at solving this problem over the course of a summer. Wildly optimistic. They didn't make significant progress, and they actually, the more I've studied it since then, the more respect I've had for the human brain, the more respect I've had for human intelligence, and to realize, to see people, my wife is German, I'm English, to see my daughter learning to speak 2 languages simultaneously and not mix them up. Just amazing how well the brain can do, to see the intelligence developing in front of your eyes. But we are now, I think, we're starting to make real progress at getting artificial intelligence out of the laboratory where I've been working on it for many years and into people's hands.
Tracey, as you started in your book to try to understand who was there at the very beginning, were you surprised by how few names there were and who those people were?
I was infuriated by the story of the founding fathers,
Yeah.
for the simple fact that it seems to ignore the many women and people in marginalised communities who were involved in the development of the computing industry and latterly artificial intelligence. the wonderful distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell from the Australian National University says that AI was cruelled from the start because this Dartmouth conference that Toby just spoke about was all about money. It was all about corporations. It was all about capitalism. There was never any discussion about how AI could help humanity and equity and the path towards progress. So one of the great joys of writing the book and doing the research was throwing farther back into history and realising that Australia's Indigenous peoples are the world's first scientists, and there's new scholarship to suggest that Australia's Indigenous women are actually the world's first coders, because weaving is a rudimentary form of coding because it's binary. It's like knitting. There's a warp and a weft. There's a knit and purl in knitting. And there's also all these women who've been forgotten. For example, the world's first computer programmer, Ada Lovelace, the daughter of Lord Byron. There's Grace Hopper, who came up with COBOL, a wonderful computer language. So I suppose that's why I started my book like that, because AI was very narrowly described and researched at the start. It was purely just a name, and it was very, very male-centric from the get-go.
It's worse than that, because for the first 20 years, the largest funder of AI research was the US military. It was designed for a purpose, which was to replace human soldiers by robot soldiers. That was the most of the funding was coming for the first 20 years from that.
And even now, it is only major tech companies that can afford to fund AI developments at the scale that they...
Yes, I mean, at least it's not the US military anymore, because they don't have as deep pockets as the tech companies, who are pouring literally billions of dollars into it. And that again is concerning, with whether it's actually now as an industry being captured by companies either in China or in California.
And there's, in both your books, multiple times at which the books really are warnings about capitalism more than they're warnings about technology.
Yes, we are talking about... Well, I mean, it's interesting that we think about whether the capitalism is the modern day corporation is the invention of the Industrial Revolution. It was invented so that we could prosper from the invention of the steam engine and the electrification of our lives, and to align that, to allow us to take risks, to allow us to exploit those technologies. But I think we're discovering that there are certain challenges. I mean, climate change is just a classic example of that, right? It's 70 companies are responsible for half of all global emissions. Right? It's not reducing your own personal individual consumption of fuel that is the matter, or your carbon footprint. It's about persuading those 70 companies to do the right thing. And it's the same about persuading the large tech companies to do the right thing. And they're certainly behaving somewhat more irresponsibly today.
Tracey, as you worked on your book, what became your largest fear about AI and what AI might do or be able to do?
This was really interesting because every expert that I interviewed said the same thing. I started with this fear about it's an existential threat to humanity, and that still does, I suppose, linger around artificial intelligence in my mind. But I think a bigger fear is almost like the microaggressions, that these biases, this discrimination will widen the gap between rich and poor, will create more dislocation in society. I mean, everyone in the audience here knows that we've all been going down silos of opinions and information in the last 5 to 10 years because of the rampant march of technology, and that creates social dislocation. So certainly we're going through the fourth industrial revolution, in which the racist, misogynistic and colonial structures of the first revolution are being scaled up. So I fear greater, more wars. I mean, everyone I interviewed said they fear there's going to be more warfare, more disagreement in society, less collaboration, more extreme opinions, and less trust in the institutions in society, which is what we've seen as journalists, with less trust in the media and government. So yes, there are fears, but they're creeping up on us because we're marinating in this source of bigotry, and we can hardly see it because we're surrounded by it every day.
Toby, we are going to talk about the good things from AI, I promise. and know that you
I
haven't,
said
you
to
haven't
Erik
given your whole life to
I
this
said to Erik,
particular...
if we're not careful, people in the audience wonder why I get up in the morning and continue to work on AI. If it's going to be...
Yes, how did you destroy humanity today? The fears that you have about AI, though, they're slightly different to Tracey's. I mean, that...
No, I actually share Tracey's fears, which is that you do hear some people stand up and say the existential risk that robots are going to take over. Well, quite honestly, robots only do what we tell them to do. And it's the fact that we're not necessarily telling them to do the right things, and we're telling them to do, and we've already seen. We should have had a foretaste of this with social media. And we got it wrong with social media. We discovered that social media wasn't bringing us together. It was driving us apart. And now we're about to do that again, but on steroids. Right? We're going to be able to do that with huge personalization, with huge amounts of data, with very persuasive tools that show us stuff that's not true. It used to be if you saw an image, picture of the Pope in a white puffer jacket, you'd say, oh, the Pope's got a white puffer jacket. No, the Pope hasn't got a white puffer jacket. Someone literally typed in, had the idea, I want a picture of the Pope in a white puffer jacket into one of these tools.
And we were all the beneficiary of that. Those of us that saw the picture of the Pope in the white puffer jacket.
We were. The person who didn't actually win out of that, sadly, was the Pope. He should have gone out and bought a white puffer jacket. He should have owned it. Won the youth vote on that one. But that's just an example of what we're going to be able to have. We're going to be able to see pictures of Trump being arrested by the NYPD. Again, completely fake. But now you start to realize how dangerous this is going to be, because it didn't take much more than that to start January the 6th. That is the potential to really corrupt our democracy, really pervert, cause violence. We're going to have to immunize ourselves to the idea that things you see are not necessarily true anymore. Things that you hear are no longer true anymore. And where does that leave us as a society where you can't trust anything you read or anything you see?
Tracey, as you worked on the book, you get towards thinking through how we address these very concerns and what needs to be put in place. And as you say, these things weren't in place ahead of social media and sort of becoming as ubiquitous as it is now. Tracey, what do you think needs to be there to sort of properly regulate and make safe the idea of AI?
We need changes at both the micro and the macro level, and we can all play a part in this. That's the positive aspect. I am, despite all the doom and gloom and fear, a glass half full kind of gal. At an individual level, we can do simple things like changing our Siri or Alexa to a male or a gender-neutral voice instead of a female voice, because we know the chatbots in the business and finance sector, they've all got male voices. It's only the domestic chatbots who've got the female voices. We can catch a Sheba instead of an Uber. We can talk to our kids and our friends and our colleagues about exactly what we're talking about today, bias in artificial intelligence, because every great social justice and civil rights movement around the world starts with education, it continues with grassroots collective movements, and then it gets the ears of government and business, and they're forced to take action. So once we start that grassroots movement, and it has been happening really for the past 10 years, and it's exploded into prominence in the last 6 months rather, I highly recommend you follow a wonderful woman called Dr. Joy Bulamwini from the Algorithmic Justice League. Sounds like a bunch of superheroes, because they are. There's a documentary called Coded Bias on Netflix that really helps lift the veil on all of these problems. But ultimately, we've got to trust our institutions to take action to regulate and legislate. I know the European Union is close to releasing something almost finalised on their suggested guidelines for governments around the world. But of course, the technology is moving so quickly that regulation is really racing to keep pace with it. And regulation is incredibly difficult because a lot of these technologies are created in Silicon Valley. And of course, there's this free market libertarian aspect of Silicon Valley that both Toby and I write about in our book, like Ayn Rand is their God. So we've got to get past that cultural barrier to explain that this is just like when cars came out and they had no seatbelts. It's crazy when you think about it. When we look back on it, this is where AI is now. We need the seatbelts.
Toby, what's your vision for how to sort of regulate, what role a state has in in AI, and what kind of protections need to be in place?
Regulation has a really important role to play, and some of it is not about necessarily just coming up with new regulation. I mean, there are a few new things that AI throws up that we haven't had in the past, but a lot of it is, and in my book I come back to, is like, well, that was just bad behavior. And we have existing laws about that. We have existing product liability laws, we have existing privacy laws. And for a long time, I don't think we thought you couldn't and you shouldn't regulate the tech space, the digital space. You couldn't because somehow it was different. It wasn't physical. It was these bits, and it was these companies that crossed international borders, and so rules didn't apply across to these multinational companies, and that you shouldn't because that was going to stifle innovation. That might have been true at the beginning of the internet. That might have been true in the 90s and the noughties, but it's not true anymore. And I think it's becoming increasingly apparent that you can regulate and you should regulate. And indeed, I have friends who work at these companies who are nice people, and they will actually say to you quietly over a beer, we would welcome some more regulation, because at the moment, it's a race to the bottom. We're doing things not because we choose to do them, but because our competitors are going to do them. And you're seeing trillion-dollar industries being created in front of your eyes. And that's what's really distressing. I mean, in the last 6 months, to see this explosion and this hype in AI take off, and to see companies that had started to behave a little more responsibly. It's been spent the last couple of years being persuaded they need ethics, they need philosophers and ethics people to help them think carefully through how to do this responsibly, and then to see them throw caution to the wind. As an example, Google had their version of ChatGPT called Lambda, came out nearly a year ago, and at the time they did the responsible thing. They said, we are not giving this to the public because we're concerned it's going to say stuff that's untrue, it's going to cause harms, it's going to damage our reputation as being the purveyors of information and truth. So we're not going to release it to the public. And they sat on it until OpenAI got in bed with Microsoft and said, we're going to put this in Bing search, and Google became nervous that their competitive advantage, that we would all switch from Google to Bing. And so they immediately announced on the same day that they were going to release this. And as far as I know, they've done nothing to fix all the problems they said it was too dangerous to release 6 months before. And so they're just backpedaling on their responsible behavior, to see that you understand why. You understand that it's a $1 trillion industry being created in front of our eyes, and whether Google exists in 6 years' time is dependent upon, maybe not. Maybe they could easily go out of business. If all of us go off and use Microsoft for our search, then Google's income would completely disappear.
Tracey, I'm keen also to ask you about those things in AI that you're excited about, the things where you see possibilities, or where you see, that life can be made better by this technology.
Particularly in medical technology, there's a wonderful app that can tell you whether you're going to get breast cancer in the next 5 years. I mean, this is phenomenal tech. There's wonderful innovations that they're using in New York with older people with dementia and Alzheimer's. A robot that will tell the person a story, and the person will, respond to the story, and it's actually helping people with their diagnoses. Obviously, in a perfect world, we would like humans to do this. But we know that particularly in a pandemic, when there were lockdowns, this technological solution was actually really valuable. There are also some tremendous advances in augmented reality, extended reality, all of this kind of stuff, the headsets. Honestly, this was a brave new world for me researching these chapters. But they're using them in diversity and inclusion training in the workplace to teach empathy, to put you in the shoes of someone in a wheelchair or a person of colour. So there are a lot of wonderful things happening. I think I read 2 days ago about antibiotics that had been created to stop the equivalent of golden staph tearing through hospitals, and that breakthrough was thanks to AI in medtech. So I don't want everybody to think it's all negative, it's all doom and gloom, but we need to keep the positives while being able to reduce the negatives. For example, also in a hospital setting, I'm 55 now. If there's a ventilator there and a Frankenstein data set has been used to create the algorithm to choose who gets the ventilator on their deathbed, they will give it to someone who's 30, more likely than me, who's over the age of 50. So all of these pieces of discrimination and bias that are being built in, they do pose a threat to humanity and reduce the possibility for us to take all of those positives out of AI, which, I mean, there are tremendous advantages.
That ventilator example is a good example, though, of how actually it's not a new philosophical problem, right? This is a problem that medical professions have faced and have not necessarily solved in an optimal way, right? So they've solved it ad hoc and so on. The technology actually hasn't changed the problem. It's just made it more concrete that we need to think carefully as a society, well, what are our priorities? What do we say, are we actually going to be saying to 55-year-olds that you're less important than 30-year-olds because you've got less of your life to live? Because maybe we've probably been doing that implicitly by the way that the medical profession has made those decisions somewhat informally. The challenge you get when you write computer code is that computers do only what you tell them to do. They do exactly what you tell them to do. So now we've actually got to face up to the stark, challenging societal choices, philosophical choices as to, well, what are our values here?
Yeah, and the issues there are actually a lack of ventilators. Just to be clear, the AI is not just choosing to not give elderly people ventilators.
That's true, but when you're facing a pandemic and respiratory disease, born diseases, then maybe we would never have enough ventilators, and you're going to have to make difficult choices. But computers actually do offer you the opportunity, perhaps, to make better choices. I mean, at least you're being honest for once about what those choices are, as opposed to what we do at the moment, which is we leave that to the doctors, and the doctors, sadly, are being forced to make those really tough choices for us as a society. And so I actually say in my book, this could be the golden age of philosophy, because we're going to have to face up to some really tough choices about what sort of society we want it to be, because we're trying to code these solutions into computers, and now we can't just pretend, waffle away and say, oh, well, the doctor will decide.
And that's something that I guess you identify in your book as well, Tracey, that really what we're confronting is the paucities of the data set that we're using, or the pre-existing behaviours that we're feeding back into machines.
Yes, it's a combination of things. It's historical data sets, which by their very nature, if part of it's taken from the 1980s, every doctor will be a he and every nurse will be a she. And then, of course, there's the bias that's built into the algorithm from the programmer, because we all have unconscious bias. And one of the people I interviewed, a wonderful expert, Ivana Bartoletti, said an algorithm is an opinion expressed in code. Technology is never neutral. And then, of course, with machine learning, I describe it like a white supremacist going down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theory websites. Everything gets exacerbated and exaggerated through machine learning. So it starts with the data sets, continues through the algorithms, and then through machine learning, that's where it's going crazy, particularly with generative AI. But I want to touch on something that we were talking about before with the ventilators, because another expert I interviewed said, look, there actually could be a benefit in the way that we can see the bias and discrimination more clearly when artificial intelligence is involved. It almost leaves a paper trail. And I think that might be a light at the end of the tunnel, that there's bias and discrimination in everyday life. We see it all the time. A lot of it's unconscious from each and every one of us. But if we can follow some kind of paper trail, if we can see that the ventilator has clearly discriminated, maybe there's a place for the law there to prove that discrimination.
Toby, I asked Tracey what excited her about AI. I feel like I should ask you the same question.
Well, what excites me is that you're using AI already, and you don't even realize it. I mean, every time you open your smartphone and ask for directions to go somewhere, every time you sit in your car and the sat-nav gets you to where you need to go, that was some artificial intelligence. It's actually one of the oldest AI algorithms. It was developed for a robot called Shaky back in the 1970s. When they built this was a fun little robot, which, as his name suggests, he sort of moved around a bit like this. wasn't very solid as a robot. But it was the first time that we tried to build, the Hollywood robot, the one with cameras on board, with a computer on board. It was autonomous. It would go off and make its own decisions. And you'd say, "Go to the library and get me a book." and it would have to work out the shortest way to get to the library and get back to where it was. That's an algorithm. It's got a name. It's called A-star search. That algorithm now is in your phone, is in your car. I mean, the funny thing is, it's now not navigating robots. It's navigating humans. But that, at least I find I'm lost a lot less than I used to be when I was doing the navigating. I used to get terribly lost all the time, right? And be throwing the map over the back seat of the car in disgust at the fact that I've managed to lose myself again. Now I get to where I need to be on time because an AI algorithm is doing that. So our lives are full of these little algorithms that are AI algorithms that are actually making our lives better and easier and faster.
And those are the small things. You've also done work where you've developed AI minesweepers, or you've done substantial things that artificial intelligence can help us with and make things better.
Yes, I mean we've been working with some very large companies looking at how they can optimize their supply chain. And when I started that project, I remember going to the CEO and saying, at the end of this job, I don't want to hear you tell me that you fired 10% of your drivers. I said, just don't promise me that you're not going to do that. And we saved them 10% of their transport costs. Big multinational company has 800 trucks. Saved them 10% of their transport cost, which was a couple of $100 million they spend on transport a year. So it was like $30 or $40 million we were saving them a year. So it's the only job I've ever worked on where they said, those strange geeky people do whatever they say. And so we saved them, a lot of money, a lot. But what was actually much more rewarding was that all of that money was fuel. Right? They employed the same number of drivers. The drivers, they said they did a survey of the drivers at the end of the job. Drivers are happier because they got home on time. They weren't having to get home late. They got to the places that they needed to be before they closed, and they were spending $30-odd million a year less on fuel, which was a lot of fuel, but also a lot of CO2, because all of that fuel is CO2.
Tracey, as you got towards finishing your book, we've sort of touched on it several times now, but the last 6 months has been a rapid acceleration of people's conception, awareness of AI and its ubiquity. Did that, given that you'd been, for 7 years working away at the book, were you surprised by the sudden rush towards the end?
I was surprised and relieved when I started writing. I thought, no one's going to read this. No one cares about AI. But then Toby did a lot of work and experts did a lot of work, and now, fortunately, it's a talking point. But yes, I was madly scrambling through the editing process, shoving anecdotes about ChatGPT in left, right and centre. The other thing that we did very quickly was we created the cover using AI. Now, Simon & Schuster have assured me that they paid the cover designer. I have to make that clear. And it was his idea. He said, look, I want to create the cover using Midjourney, this app, to show people the impact on the creative sector, whether it's words or images. Actually, incidentally, how many of you have used an image generator like Midjourney or Stable Diffusion? It is remarkable in how effective it is. You put in prompts, we put in 12 different words, and it came up with this incredible image, although the first image was not so great because of the biases built into it. I wanted an image of a strong robot woman looking to the future with concern but hope. I was quite specific. But it came up with this image of a very sexualised robot woman with a tiny waist and huge breasts and enormous biceps. So obviously the algorithm reads strong as guns. So a few friends of mine have joked that Midjourney is very much like a 14-year-old boy in the way that he views the world. So we had to tweak the prompts to get a better, more stylised image. But it taught us also what a challenge this is, particularly for the creative industries, because there's a copyright issue. All of the images, billions of images scraped to create this image, they're associated with people's copyright. And if people can do it easily and cheaply or for free in a lot of cases, there's really no laws to protect them at this stage, and that's a huge issue.
Well, there are laws. That's where exactly copyright law. That's where we've been sold a lie again by Silicon Valley. they've scraped copyright, and it's not clear that is actually an acceptable use of copyright. And there are class action suits going down in the US on that very issue, right? Because it's not clear. This is like the Napster moment, right? Streaming other people's music is violating their copyright. Stealing their images ultimately is perhaps violating their copyright, and that has to be decided by the courts.
What is
it? But I think it's also worth pointing out to say how quickly the field is advancing. So I mean, that's a pretty good image. But if you go back 2 years, it was pathetic and grainy and fuzzy and nothing you would write home about. And to see the technical advance, and then also to see how quickly it's being put into the hands of people. I mean, that's why it's got everyone's attention, is because it's not surprising. ChatGPT is the fastest growing app ever, of any app. I mean, it's faster growing than Facebook, much faster than Instagram. Anything else, nothing else has captured users as quickly. It was 1 million people at the end of the first week, 100 million at the end of the second month, and now it's in the hands of over 1 billion people. And that is why we are in, I think, actually in some sense, a unique moment in history, which is we've gone through other technological changes and transformations when we invented the steam engine, the internal combustion engine, when we electrified our lives. We've changed our world with technology quite radically in the past. But all of those revolutions happened slowly. It took 50-odd years for the Industrial Revolution really to take impact. It started in the northeast of England and slowly spread out around the world. You can go from something that was an idea on a whiteboard to 6 months later being in the hands and being used by 1 billion people. We've never had technologies before where you've been able to have that footprint so quickly.
And does that mean we're at a kind of tipping point where the questions that are in your book and Tracey's need urgently to be addressed?
They do need urgently to be addressed, because even small harms, when multiplied by billions, are significant. And we're already starting to see it. We saw 2 or 3 days ago, the stock market was moved by one of those fake images, a picture of the Pentagon with an explosion, completely fake, but stock prices were moved by it. We're going to see elections change by it. I'm pretty fearful of what's going to happen in the US presidential election, because we saw what happened with the misuse of social media. Well, now we've got these tools where everything you see, you have to question.
And that does, though, perhaps swing people back to more discerning engagement with the world, greater...
Well, as an editor of a newspaper...
I'm not pushing for newspapers, but there
no,
is...
but it is... I think it really is the moment. I think, one of the consequences of this is that we're going to suddenly realise that social media is... You can't trust anything on social media, essentially. And unless you know where it comes from, we're going to have to say, well, where do we get news that we trust? Where do we get information we trust? We get it from... the old-fashioned news sources and encyclopedias and the places that we used to trust.
And that goes to a lot of your thinking, it seems, around AI, Tracey, is around education, needing to know what we're doing and to be engaged with trying to change minds before people are, sort of manipulated by data.
Yeah, what I hope happens from this era is that it ushers in a golden age of critical thinking, because we need it now more than ever before, particularly with our children and the young people in our lives. Even if, there's that expression, digital natives, yes, but critical thinking goes above that. It's more in the realm of the social sciences. What I hope that we do as a society is sit back a bit and realise we are living through a stage of late-stage capitalism. And unless we start to question the really big structures around us, I mean, towards the end of my book, I have a chapter on utopia and a chapter on dystopia. And a lot of the utopian thought in the last couple of 100 years surrounds socialist societies as being a way forward for utopia. What I would say is that we certainly will need a large redistribution of wealth if it keeps going the way it is, because big tech is like big tobacco. Some of these companies have profit margins larger than the GDPs of nation states, and something's got to give. It opens up a discussion about universal basic income and how we can reduce the gap between rich and poor for the future. So I think there are opportunities here as well as dangers.
I'm going to disagree with the language you used there, which was the redistribution of wealth, which is actually, I think we need to push back against the concentration of wealth that we're seeing. It's the fact that we were actually living in a much more equitable society 30 or 40 years ago. And it's that concentration that we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years, a lot of it into the hands of people who have been developing digital technologies, that is what we need to push back. It's not a redistribution. It's like, let's return to the equity that we saw at the beginnings of, the Industrial Revolution, where we saw wealth being a bit spread around a bit more equally. It's only the last 50 years that we've seen wealth really start to concentrate, and the equity that we see in society disappear. So even if we just return to what we had, that would be a good thing.
And even Bill Gates says that we need to go back to the way it was. So when you've got tech billionaires saying we need wealth to be distributed more equitably, you know you're at a tipping point.
Yeah, I mean, so you go back to one of the first technologists, Henry Ford. He was asked, why are you paying your workers on the production line there so much? He said, well, who's going to buy the next round of cars? Which was very astute. And similarly, our society is going to implode if we don't actually spread the wealth a bit more equitably, like we used to, actually. And also to think, this isn't the first industrial transformation we've gone through, and to look back and perhaps, look at the lessons we learned from those past changes, and you think back, well, when we started the Industrial Revolution, we changed our lives dramatically, right? We'd go out and work in the fields, we'd go out, and then we found jobs in factories and offices, but we changed our society to deal with those changes. It was so that Marx and people were wrong, that the wealth was not concentrated into the hands of just the owners of the factories. We introduced unions to protect the rights of workers. We introduced the welfare state to support people. We introduced universal education to educate people with jobs. We introduced universal pensions in many countries, so we made some pretty radical structural changes to society to spread the benefits around, to support the rights of workers, to go through that transformation. And I think we're going for an equally large transformation, possibly even quicker, that's the problem, than that time. And we need to think radically. And as you say, things like universal basic income. We need to... We forget we had universal basic income through the pandemic. It was called Job Seeker, Job Keeper. We paid people to stay home, and the economy didn't crash. It was a remarkable idea that people say, oh, you can possibly afford that. Well, we afforded it. And interestingly enough, people, despite all of the concerns about the pandemic, anxiety levels and mental health improved dramatically through that period, when people didn't have to worry so much about, and so I think, we need to have these important conversations, and they need to be not just, journalists and tech people like myself. They need to be broad conversations in all of our society about, well, what sort of society are we going to build with this technology?
I'm going to invite questions from the audience. If anyone has a question and wants to come forward, there's microphones at the front of the stage. While people are moving, I do just want to ask Toby, because you've worked in this field for so long, and this question might not be a fair one, but what is the next breakthrough that you expect to see in AI, or that you're excited to see?
Well, it's worth saying that the systems we've got today, things like ChatGPT, are still remarkably stupid. I've got an example where you can get ChatGPT to fail to count to 2 properly. So they're very good, perhaps sometimes being described stochastic parrots. They're very good at repeating back, reflecting back the sorts of things that we read on the internet, because they're trained on the internet. They're literally, a mirror of what you can find, and they're very good at saying things that are probable, but they're not very good at reasoning. And so the next breakthrough, and we don't know how to do this, is how can we get them to reason like humans, not just be able to, they can convincingly say things. Sometimes it's only, as you say, it's a B+. The introduction was only a B+. That will get better, but equally, they're terribly poor at reasoning at the moment. So that's good news for humanity. We can still outthink them, but we will work on how we can build systems that can not only command language like they do now, but also command reasoning.
Tracey, is there a AI breakthrough that you're waiting for or expecting before we take questions?
No, I'm happy to take questions. I know we've got limited time, and I'd love people to have their say and ask what they want to ask.
Let's start over here.
What I understand is that the robots will integrate in what they see on the ground and make decisions of who's going to live and who's not going to live. Can you talk a bit more about where that development is at and where the ethics and the moral reasoning comes in from the military?
Well, thank you for that question. That's something that does keep me awake at night. And I've had the privilege to speak at the United Nations about this topic, warning about the dangers of this topic for half a dozen times now. And unfortunately, you look at what's happening in Ukraine, and you see increasingly autonomous drones. You see warfare being transformed in front of our eyes, and you can see the military advantages. I use scare quotes around that about the idea of that the military see this as an attractive way, but equally, as the questioner rightly pointed out, machines are not. Machines are making decisions about who lives and who dies, and that's something that they should never be allowed to do. Machines are not moral. Machines don't have consciousness. Machines cannot be held accountable for their decisions. Only humans can be held accountable for their decisions, and so we should avoid waking up in a world that machines have the right to make those sorts of decisions, because we know what that world looks like. It's the world that Hollywood has portrayed for us. And it's just going to look like a really bad Hollywood movie. But we don't have to end up in that world. We get to make a choice. There are lots of technologies where we've decided they're just inhumane, terrible ways to fight war, and we don't have to do them. We've decided that with chemical weapons, biological weapons, nuclear weapons to a certain extent, cluster munitions, blinding lasers. You can go on through the list. There's a whole raft of technologies. And so there are discussions going on at the UN that I've helped to contribute to, but still ongoing, where I encourage you to talk to your political representatives and make your feelings known on these topics. That if they feel enough people are concerned about this, then they will be forced eventually to regulate these.
One of the lesser discussed aspects of killer robots was brought up by one of the Australian experts I interviewed, Dr. Katrina Wallace, and she said, with the bias that's embedded in this technology, does this mean that AI bots or drones in war zones will target women, children and people in marginalised communities? And then there's the flip side of facial recognition technology, which really struggles with people of colour. So if it's a search and rescue mission, say in Iraq or Afghanistan, and they're using technology, does that mean perhaps some women will be left behind because they're wearing a face covering? So there's a whole bunch of really problematic issues here, and we know that AI is being used in warfare today with all of these problems embedded.
And sadly, they will be used against women and children because machines are not going to question orders, right? So previously, if you wanted to do harm, if you wanted to do evil, you had to persuade people to do that. You had to train them, equip them, and persuade them to do your evil. Well, now you just need one programmer, and it doesn't matter how obscene the task, they will carry it out.
Question here.
Hi. I was wondering, you guys were talking about the I guess, intransigence of tech companies to consider being regulated, that they've kind of been resistant to that. Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, gave testimony at US Congress saying that he wanted ChatGPT and other kinds of generative AI to be regulated. I have trouble knowing how seriously to take him when he says that, and I wondered if you had an assessment of how sincere he was being, or if perhaps that was a tactical thing that he said there.
Well, Sam Altman turned around, I don't know whether you saw it 2 days ago, and then followed up his previous statement by saying, we will not do any business with the European Union if they go through with these regulations. So I just can't believe a word that they say, put simply.
Yeah, the advice I was told was that if you're called to testify in front of Congress, they're going to beat you around the head a few times, like they did Mark Zuckerberg. So you can choose to push back against that, but you're just going to look bad. Or you can choose to acquiesce, and at least you'll have an easier time when you're up there, but it will be the same net consequence.
Question on this side.
In the 50s, a writer called Isaac Asimov set up these laws of robotics that were supposed to prevent an uncontrolled algorithm. Does anybody talk about that anymore?
does anyone talk about Isaac Asimov's laws? No, because his laws, even when he proposed them, were a fictional device to demonstrate the inadequacy of the laws. Right? All his stories were about how you could fall between the three rules about harming people and protecting themselves. But people do try and formalize the idea of what are the principles. But the challenge is how you turn that into practice. It's very easy to come up with high-level principles. The famous one of I.J. Good. Treat others as you would like to be treated yourself. That's a pretty good modus operandi. But the problem is how you turn that into practice.
Hi there. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you perceive AI is affecting the hiring process.
Tracey, do you want to start with that?
Oh, yes, this is something that makes my head explode because the technology still hasn't been worked out properly. And if companies like Amazon can't work it out with all of their billions, then we have huge problems. So what happens with these hiring algorithms is obviously they use data from the past, and in the past, predominantly, it was men and white people who dominated the workplace. So even though Amazon, in this particular example, and this happened about 7 or 8 years ago, went back and tried to change the algorithm to remove the bias from it, it still kept throwing out CVs of women, people of colour, people with disabilities, because it looked for clues in other parts of the CV. So, for example, say in the CV it didn't have your name and it didn't state your gender, but it had in your interests, I've played in a women's basketball team. The algorithm worked out that you were a woman and put your CV to the side. So this is a huge problem in the workplace, and I fear that with machine learning we're going to end up with workplaces that look a lot like Mad Men right back in the 1950s.
I agree. I'm just waiting for all the... There's over 100 startups in Silicon Valley using AI to help scan CVs and help the HR hiring process. And I'm just waiting for the class action suits to happen because it's a disaster. Lawyers will make a lot of money in this place. That's all I can tell.
Thank you.
As usual.
Okay, sure. Thanks for your presentation. Thanks for your time. My question is about large language models. I'm just going to confirm my understanding of it, and also, basically, when you input information, say, for example, Alphabet's got their Lambda, Meta's got the Llama, and Microsoft's got the ChatGPT. When you input information and they produce an outcome, who fully owns it? Do we own it, or do they own it?
Interesting question. Well, what people don't realise, and you should realise, it's the social media playbook again, is that you're improving the algorithm. Every time you're typing prompts, all of that information is going back and is feeding back into the algorithm, improving it. So every day it gets a bit better. And so they typically own the data. So, which is why if you work in a law firm or something, you're being told, don't use these because you'll be giving up client-sensitive information to another company.
Oh, no, it's probably a tangential point, but it reminds me that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And a lot of us do an awful lot of unpaid work for the tech giants every time we fill out a survey, every time we play with this technology. And I know we need to play with it to keep up with it and to improve it, especially in the case of ChatGPT. But it infuriates me that it represents unpaid labour.
Yeah. Although, on a positive note, there will be very soon enterprise-level products. So your company will have their own large language model that sits in your own server that you can type your own data into. So that problem will be solved very quickly.
Question here.
Thank you so much. It's been such a fascinating session, and I feel like a whole day could have been dedicated to it. But I was wondering, what's your advice to parents, principals, university deans about the use of ChatGPT? Because I know that some schools say, yes, you can use it, and others say, absolutely not. I mean, it's something that I don't know whether you can ban, really. It's naive in my mind.
Yeah, I was at a school the other night and one of the teachers said to me she'd been using it for 6 months for her lesson plans and hadn't realised the bias inherent within it. So my advice is never to ban anything 100% because we simply can't. It's inevitable and we need to learn to live with it. Machines and humans need to learn to work together and we need to master it rather than letting it master us. In the case of ChatGPT, I would highly recommend that people in schools, parents, students, learn as much about it as possible and do play with it and try to teach it to be better and keep up with it, because I just don't think we can put too many guardrails on things like that. Obviously we need to learn, particularly teachers, how to work out which students have used it to write an essay, and the only way to do that is to become more educated about it.
I'm reminded, again, history rhyming, of the debate that we had when calculators came out. And it was very similar in many respects. And of course, calculators ultimately won, right? If you're in high school or university, you get to use a calculator. You know, I've got a calculator on my watch. I've got a calculator on my phone. You've always got calculators with you. But the important thing is, still, primary school, you don't have a calculator. You get taught how to do arithmetic, because that's an important skill, to understand numbers and how arithmetic works. And similarly, I think we're going to perhaps end up in the same point, which is that there are important skills that you won't learn if you just use these tools, about critical thinking, about expressing yourself, about being able to construct an argument, and that we will still insist people use pencil and paper without access to these tools, so that they develop muscle with these particular skills. And then, of course, once you've mastered that, these are great tools to amplify your productivity. They're going to be part of our lives. I'm never writing another business letter. I'm never writing another, annual performance plan. ChatGPT does that for me, right? And that was totally waste of my time to do that, right? Those were very formulaic. ChatGPT's got the formula. I can personalize it to what I want. So that's a great benefit. Similarly, they can write lots of code. There's lots of really useful things they can do. And they're going to be everywhere in our lives. They're going to be really useful amplifiers of us. But equally, we must remember, like with calculators and arithmetic, we need the basic skills.
Thanks so much.
Hi, thank you very much. A great panel and an awesome suit.
Thank you. Thank you.
Feminist rock. So I want to say I teach critical thinking in a university, and already every essay submitted is run to a plagiarism test electronically. So this will happen with chat. All this stuff the university system will be working through it now. But I wanted to say, because I do teach critical thinking around gender and class and race, I want to suggest that 50 years ago, when you were talking, Toby, that there was not equality. It wasn't equality 50 years ago, where we might see a more explosive differential. Now I want to suggest that colonisation is that, already an explosion. People with disabilities who are still not able to access so many things, women like me who come from more non-accessible backgrounds. So diversity will happen. And I also think with this, what will be really interesting with this is that there will be failures. We will watch failures, and there will be an education in this technology. Thank you.
I certainly wasn't suggesting that many of those challenging issues around equality and so on were better 50 years ago. The only point I was trying to make was, I thought back then I remember us being more optimistic about the role that technology was going to play. And I think we're perhaps less optimistic now that the role that technology is going to play.
And Tracey, that's really the striving point of your book, is that if we're not conscious of bias and inequality in the technology, it'll only worsen.
That's exactly right. We can't just sit back and be passive about this. We have to be active. And thank you so much for that comment. When you were talking about people in marginalised communities and those living with disabilities, one thing that really struck me researching the book was smart home technology. I don't know whether many of you have that in the home. And when I started researching the book, I thought, oh no, I just want a dumb home. I don't want to be hacked. But living with a dynamic disability last year, when even getting up to turn on or off a light switch was difficult, I thought there's such a role for technology in smart homes for people with disabilities, only if they're included from the outset in the design process, because then it will help the people it's supposed to help the most.
On that note, Toby, Tracey, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming.